But we're really excited about today. Professor Donald Kagan was kind of the patron saint of our programs. We're very happy to kind of get more and more Kagans involved as fast as we can. Robert Kagan is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, a New York Times best-selling author, a columnist for the Washington Post, contributing editor at the Weekly Standard and New Republic, and worked at the State Department and the Reagan administration, primarily for Secretary of State Schultz. He's also a Yale man, graduated in 1980, and we found this quote from the Daily News, which I'm going to pull up, which I had before, and it's going to take me a second to find, but I think it's very fitting to start this off. This is after Dr. Kagan restarted The Politic as a magazine, if I believe, right? And the YDN wrote, Kagan's contentious views have left the public struggling to define his political affiliations. While some friends call him an open-minded maverick, Washington, D.C. has labeled him a neoconservative. But these views, which he bases largely on historical analysis, have their origins in a world that predates Gulf Wars and supranational organizations in Europe. Instead, they stem from a Yale experience filled with all-nighters working on his startup magazine, the Yale Political Monthly, and raging games of diplomacy in his common room. So we're very excited to hear his thoughts as they've extended from that day to where he is now. So, Dr. Kagan.
Well, thank you very much, Harry. You left out the legacy at Yale that I left that I'm most proud of, which was I was the co-founder and inventor of the Pearson Inferno, which was the best party at Yale for about 25 years. It was the Halloween party at Pearson, and it was such a good party that Yale ultimately banned it. So I must say that's the kind of thing at my age that I'm really proud of having been part of. Thank you for having me here. It's a treat from a number of perspectives. It's great to be back at Yale. It's great to be here with my parents in the front row. I did have occasion to take lecture courses where my father was up here and I was down there, and it's very odd for me to be up here while he's down there. So I'll try to muscle my way through that. I'm particularly glad to see those of you who are here that you're out knowing that I'm going to be talking about foreign policy, because I hear tell that across the nation Americans aren't interested in foreign policy anymore. Certainly their politicians don't want to talk about foreign policy. But I believe that it's still a vitally important subject. And it's interesting because I've been, over the past couple of years, studying another period in American history where Americans also didn't care about foreign policy, and particularly the period from the end of the First World War through the 20s and into the 30s. It was a very interesting time, and I think worth thinking about for a moment as we look at our present situation, the international scene, and America's place in it, and American attitudes towards America's place in it. As you well know, World War I was a war that Americans went into with great enthusiasm, but came out of tremendously disillusioned. The promises that they felt were made, the goals that they thought they were fighting for, they wound up being quite disappointed in the outcome, and really left that war feeling very powerfully that they never wanted to do anything like that again. They didn't want to fight in any other wars, and they certainly didn't want to fight in any wars in Europe. Now, partly this was a result of a political event, which was the defeat of Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations and the American role as part of the Versailles settlement that Wilson had helped negotiate. And you may not be completely shocked to know that this defeat was very much a partisan battle. The Republicans before 1920 had been the internationalist party. The Democrats had been the more anti-interventionist party, but Wilson had transformed it, and now the Republicans were flipping back again, something that happens in American history over and over again. And it was really to deal a blow to Wilson that they defeated the League of Nations more than any principled opposition to it. But the effect was to completely wipe out any consensus in favor of international involvement after World War I. And in Europe, this took a particularly acute form. It wasn't just that the Americans and their administrations, 3 successive Republican administrations, didn't want to fight another war in Europe. They didn't want to do anything which could conceivably lead to any kind of deeper American involvement in Europe. So they really pursued a policy of trying not to have anything to do with what was going on in Europe in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And that, of course, included any involvement whatsoever with the League of Nations, to the point where when mail came from the League of Nations addressed to the U.S. government in the first year of the Harding administration, it was dropped in a dead letter box, unopened. It was considered unacceptable even to open the mail from the League of Nations. It gives you some sense of how extreme the aversion was to any kind of involvement. And that really set the tone, even though they eventually did started answering the mail from the League. They certainly didn't want to participate with the League. And then we all know where this ultimately led. The non-interventionism of the 20s led to the non-interventionism bordering on the isolationism of the 30s, and then ultimately to the outbreak of the Second World War and America eventually being dragged into it. What Americans discovered as a result of all that, or at least many discovered, and what we can certainly see in retrospect, is that Europe had entered a cycle of conflict, competition, and warfare from which it could not extricate itself without some kind of external involvement. That was certainly the lesson of the First World War, where the United States came in and broke up what had been a stalemate favoring Germany and turned the tide in favor of Britain and France. And the Versailles Settlement was built around the existence of American power and maintaining a role in Europe. And when the United States pulled itself back out, Europe returned to that cycle, which had really, I guess, begun at the very least with the unification of Germany in the third quarter in around 1870, 1871, which had created the German problem, which was a Germany too big for Europe. Germany was in Europe was in what the international relations theorists would call a security dilemma. The rising strength of any power would lead to a response by the others, and there was no way for Europe to achieve any kind of equilibrium and stability by itself. And the role that the United States wound up playing in Europe after the Second World War, as a result of the Second World War and following the Second World War, was really to solve the European crisis, was really to put an end to this terrible cycle of warfare that seemed to have no way of resolving itself. The United States was a kind of deus ex machina in the European system, and it was able to play this role because the United States had certain qualities, some of which were purely geographical, which allowed it to play a role that no other power had ever played with regard to Europe, and a role which no European power could play by itself. Put in the simplest form, the United States has been, and certainly by then was, in the unique position of being a very powerful country that was not surrounded by any other dangerous or great powers. And I say that with all due apologies to Canada and Mexico. The United States lived in a very safe and secure environment, which allowed it, in a way that no other country could do or has ever been able to do, really, allowed it to send the bulk, if not the entirety, of its military capacity far from its shores to engage in a foreign conflict and to bring stability in a foreign situation without imperiling its own security. That is a sort of unique geographical quality. Britain could never really play that role, and certainly the other powers in Europe couldn't, because the threats that they faced were all close to home. So the United States could play this role, and the distance of the United States from the rest, from Europe, also made it possible for the European powers to accept a military role in Europe, an American military presence in Europe, because they did not fear that the United States was going to use that military power to commit aggression against them, whereas they always did fear that the military power of their neighbors would be used against them. So the United States was able by injecting itself into the European equation in a completely unique and different way. I can really not think of any other power in the history of the world that has this particular quality to bring some peace and stability to the European continent. It did the same thing in Asia. Asia had also fallen into a cycle of conflict, mostly driven by the rise of Japan, which played the role that Germany played in Europe, in Asia. A nation that was growing more powerful, that was growing ambitious as a result of its power, and had entered into a cycle of conflict, mostly with and against China, but with repeated wars beginning in the 1890s, repeated efforts by Japan to expand its power militarily, and as a result of World War II and America implanting itself militarily in the East Asian theater, the United States brought an end to that cycle as well. Now, I emphasize this sort of basic material quality of what America was able to accomplish in the world because I do want to say, as we move forward in this discussion, I'm not here to claim that America is this wonderful nation of great virtue that constantly sought to bring wonderful happiness and security to the rest of the world. You know, Winston Churchill famously said that the United States could always be counted on to do the right thing after exhausting all the other alternatives. And he did not mean that as a compliment. I think Americans take that as a compliment somehow, but he didn't mean it as a compliment because he had lived through 20 years of the United States not doing the right thing until it was absolutely almost too late to prevent the catastrophe, and even then, only because the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. So it is not wisdom or particular virtue that brings the United States to be able to play this role. A lot of it is just happenstance. Nevertheless, the basic security environment that the United States created after World War II made it possible for the human race to move into a new kind of world order, a different world order than had existed in the past, and unique in some really critical ways. And I want to focus on three ways in particular in which the world order that America played such a big role in creating, how different this world order was. The first is simply a question, importantly, a question of economics. If you think about the period from the end of the Second World War to, let's say, 2000 roughly, but you can go beyond, it is a period of unprecedented prosperity in the history of mankind. Insofar as anyone can measure GDP, global GDP, through the millennia, and some people have tried. Angus Madison has tried as an economic historian to do this. You won't be surprised to know that throughout most of human history, average annual growth of global GDP was roughly zero. That mostly the most of human history is about poverty, with a very few number of people living in some kind of wealth, but without generating any new wealth. That's most of human history. As far as Madison is able to measure the period from 1500 to about 1820, which is basically when the Industrial Revolution goes into full swing, global GDP grew at about 0.3%. From 1820 to 1950, which is sort of the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, global GDP grew roughly at 1.6%. I know these percentages are kind of ridiculous, but you get the general sense on an annual basis. The striking thing about the American world order, or the world order that America has supported since World War II, is that global GDP growth has been about 4% on an annual basis. And when we're talking about 5 or 6 billion people, the difference between 1.6% and 4% is enormous. So it's been a tremendous period of prosperity, and the interesting thing about this period, as opposed to even that period between 1820 and 1950, is that whereas in that earlier period, almost the entirety of the growth and prosperity was occurring in the transatlantic space, mostly in Europe and in the United States, mostly with Europe benefiting from their colonial outreach, but the profits really and the growth occurring within Europe. The striking thing about the period from 1950 to the present, as we see all around us, is that the enormous growth of GDP and prosperity outside the transatlantic space, whether we're talking about China or India or in Latin America, Brazil, all these rising economies that we've seen. That's been the characteristic of this period. Now again, this is not because America was doing anything wonderful. The Chinese lifted themselves out of poverty. The Indians lifted themselves out of poverty. But I would submit that the United States created an environment in which this could occur. That the free trade, free market environment in a period of relative peace among the great powers made it possible for this amazing revolution in the global economy to take place. And just to give a sense of it, as Paul Collier has noted, if you think that beginning throughout this period, at the beginning there were like 5 billion people in poverty out of the 6 billion people. There was 1 billion that was relatively well off and 5 billion that were in poverty. Over the course of this period, 4 out of those 5 billion have moved out of poverty, leaving what Collier refers to as the bottom billion, which is the problem that we have been unable to solve. But what we have seen is 4 billion people move out of poverty. It's really quite extraordinary, and again, completely unprecedented in human history, a history which has been about abject poverty for the most part. The second and undoubtedly related element of this world order is the incredible spread of democratic government, which we're all aware of. But if you think about it, again, before 1900, there were roughly 5 countries that could be called democracies in the world. As a result of World War I, it got up to about 24, but then the rise of fascism rolled that back, the Depression rolled that back, so on the eve of World War II, there were maybe 10 or 12 democracies in the world. Well, today there are 115 democracies in the world. Now, partly that's because there's more nations in the world because of the decolonization, but even so, what we've seen is an unprecedented explosion of democratic government around the world. And again, especially if you compare it to the great sweep of human history going back before the birth of Christ, we're talking about almost all peoples throughout that time living under various forms of tyranny, with some very brief and shining moments of democratic governance like ancient Greece or Venice or a couple of other places. But this period is characterized by the widespread of democracy. And then finally, there is the fact that I began with at the beginning. This has been a period without great power war. There have been plenty of wars. There have been terrible conflicts of one kind or another. There have been genocides, all horrible. I'm not making any claim for the wonderfulness of this period in that regard, but in this one very important area, which is great power war, we have been spared that throughout this period, and that also is unlike the great expanse of human history, especially since the formation of states. Throughout most of history, states have been at war with one another. Certainly the first half of the 20th century doesn't even need to be commented on. The 19th century was, by comparison, relatively peaceful, but it began with what, until that point, was the worst and most destructive war that anyone had ever seen, which was the Napoleonic Wars. We don't even pay attention to the Crimean War. It doesn't even rise on our radar screen, but it involved about 2 million troops and I think had, over 500,000 casualties, if not more. We don't think about the Franco-Persian War, Franco-Prussian War of 1870 also involved millions of troops with very heavy casualties. Those don't even appear on our radar screen. And then, of course, we go into World War I. Before that, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, the great powers of Europe were almost constantly at war in one way or another with each other. So this period, again, sort of strikingly, is known for the war that never happened, which was the war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, again, there's more than one cause of that. Nuclear weapons may have something to do with it, although I don't think they have everything to do with it. I can imagine a great power war that remains sub-nuclear. We can discuss that afterwards if you like. I do think it has been the overwhelming power of the United States which has discouraged the possibility of great power war. I think one thing that we've learned from the study of history is that multipolar systems where you have a number of powers of roughly equal strength in the same international system, they are more prone to war than the situation we've had now of one power being predominant. And the reason is that nations like that are always testing each other. They never know exactly who has the more power, who might win a conflict, what constellation of alliances might emerge that would give them an advantage. Whereas in a situation where everybody sort of knows what the hierarchy is, and it's very hard to change it, as it has been for quite some time in this period, that is in fact proven to be a force of stability, when no one really doubts whether the United States is the strongest power in the world. So that is the order that we've been enjoying. I must say, I think we often take it for granted. I think we don't think very much about how special this period has been because we're naturally and understandably preoccupied with all the things that are wrong with it. I think this is true in our personal lives too. We're very aware of the things that are not going right and sometimes take for granted the things that are. But I think it's important now and then to step back and realize how unique this period has been. Unique in three ways, any one of which would make it a special period, but the three of them together really make it quite extraordinary. So the next question that arises is, where are we going now? I think in addition to taking it for granted, we've actually had some people arguing, and I think there are many people who may believe, that this is not the product of some power relationship. It's not the product of what the United States has done or hasn't done. It's really a product of the evolution of the human species. This is basically the argument that Frank Fukuyama made in his famous article, The End of History. Mankind had simply learned, through the process of argument and experiment, had learned that democracy was the best form, that liberal democracy was simply the best form of government. The best form won in a competition with other forms, whether with fascism or communism. You hear people like Steven Pinker, I guess he's an evolutionary biologist. Is that what he would call himself? In any case, he wrote a book recently noting that the incidence of violent death among all human beings has been steadily declining. And what I find interesting about that is the date he picks to begin that study is 1945. So to me, the question is it really the case that the human race is just getting better and better and better and learning and getting less violent and becoming more democratic, more peaceful? Or are we living in a system that has made people more like that, and were that system to end or change, you could see a different kind of species? I must say that my prejudice leads me to believe that human nature doesn't change. The only things that change are whether it's contained, channeled by forces that are larger than any individual. I think we see enough around the world today when people, given the opportunity to commit horrendous crimes against each other, against their fellow human beings, against their own citizens, don't blink at taking that opportunity. And the reason that's not happening on the international scene is because there is a power and a group of powers that are upholding some kind of order. The next question that arises is, well, could you have this order even if American power were not such a big part of it? And if you read the works of people like Fareed Zakaria, for instance, or these days Richard Haas, you get the impression that their view is, yes, you could have the United States play a smaller role in the world, but you'd still get the same order. Some others would step up to, pick up the pole and raise the tent, whether it was China or India or Brazil or Russia or what have you, that somehow it's not so much dependent on the United States anymore. I think if you read the work of John Eikenberry, who is a great believer in the solidity of liberal institutions, he believes that at a certain point the institutions can stand on their own. He acknowledges that American power was necessary to establish those international liberal institutions, but at a certain point they take on a life of their own, and you can begin to see American power fade, and they would still be there. Again, count me as skeptical that that's the case. It seems to me that history teaches very clearly that international orders rise and fall. They depend on the powers that created them to sustain them. There was an Egyptian order, there was a Greek order, there was a Roman order, there was a European order in which the Europeans shaped the international environment. Each one of these orders reflected the preferences, the interests, the values of the powers that created and sustained them, and each one fell when those powers were no longer able to uphold the order that they'd created. The Roman Empire did not last beyond Roman power. And not only were, basic economic relations changed, basic power relations changed, even things like knowledge changed. Scientific understanding was set back by the fall of the Roman Empire. That people forgot how to make cement and didn't rediscover it for, 1,000 years, if not more. We can't delude ourselves that the order that we've been enjoying, which is fairly brief as these things go, necessarily outlasts the powers that created them. If you ask me whether we would look to China, for instance, to support a liberal international order of the kind that we've seen around the world, I think it's unreasonable even to ask them to do so. They may have an interest in the global economy from which they've benefited tremendously, but would they step in, if the United States were stepping out, would they step in to uphold that economy? The Chinese economy itself is not a liberal economy. It has a capitalist element, but which is clearly subsumed to the needs of the party to maintain itself in power. It's unreasonable to imagine that that kind of system could become the upholder of a free market international, free trade international economic order. And it's worth recalling, that kind of economic order, the one we enjoy today, has also been extremely rare in human history. It's been the case since 1945, when the United States decided it was in its interest to uphold that kind of economy. It existed under British hegemony, certainly hegemony of the seas, when the British Empire was at its peak, and the British felt that a generally free trade environment was in its interest. But if you go back to the 1920s, the rising power of that day was the United States. The United States didn't even believe in free trade at that time, and was not really ready to uphold that kind of international system. So we're supposed to believe that the Chinese today, of all people, would be the ones to uphold that order. Or that we would expect that China and Russia, if they were the co-equals of the United States, would play the same role in attempting to support democratic governments or undermine dictatorships, which even the United States has done inconsistently. Nevertheless, there's been a general trend. If we see Russia and China's behavior at the UN Security Council, nothing is clearer than they are opposed to the efforts of the liberal world to impose its values on other nations. They are the great upholders of the Westphalian principle that you shouldn't intervene in other countries. We shouldn't be surprised if Russia and China never want to help the democracies overthrow a fellow dictatorship. And I don't think you could expect, if the situation arose where the Russians and Chinese had equal say over what happened in the international system as the United States does today, that you would see the same general flowering of democracy that we've seen up until now. It seems to me we would have to recognize that the decline of American power would lead to a different kind of order, an order that was less clearly reflective of the things that Americans value, more reflective of things that other people value, or, and I think equally likely, that this order would descend merely into disorder, at least for a time. That is what happened when the European order collapsed. It didn't lead smoothly with the United States sort of picking up the torch and filling in for Britain and the other democracies in upholding the order that the Europeans had established. It simply collapsed into the worst world war that the human race had ever seen. I'm not suggesting that we're any 5 minutes away from some horrendous world war, but in 1920 you wouldn't have thought so either. And yet it wasn't very long before things changed dramatically. So the next question, it seems to me, if you're able to buy any of the stuff that I've said so far, which is that the United States has to, if we want to keep this world order, the United States has to keep playing the role that it's played in the world that created it, is can the United States do so? And I think one of the things that we've seen most pervasively over the past couple of years is, or even maybe 5 years, since the Great Recession hit, is the very strong belief that whether we like it or not, whether it's good or bad, the United States is no longer capable of playing the role that it's played in the past. We have obviously been dealing with a lot of declinism. Now again, the person who made this most famous was Fareed Zakaria with his book, The Post-American World, in 2008. As I said, he thinks the post-American world will look just like the American world, so that's good news. But if you don't think that, then America's decline would be meaningful. And I'd like to really, briefly at least, address the question of whether America really is in decline. Because I've tried to take, I think, a fairly straightforward look at this question, and I don't see it as clearly as other people do, apparently. The one thing that I want to say in thinking about American decline is when we talk about the declining influence of the United States, my first question is always compared to when? Because we have this very rosy view of a past. You always hear people say these days, we can no longer tell everyone what to do. We can no longer get our allies to do exactly what we want them to do. To which my question was, when was that? I can't remember a time, I can't think of a time when it was the case that the United States could do anything it wanted to do, and everything it tried to do, it succeeded at. I think people tend to look back on, the establishment of the NATO, of the European Security Order, NATO, the Marshall Plan. It was a great moment. It was a great success in foreign policy. It did, I think, save Europe, or more accurately, half of Europe. People tend to forget that it was accompanied by the Soviet occupation of the other half of Europe. And people tend to forget at this same time in 1945, in the period of 1945 to 1955, when the United States was supposed to be, as we imagine it, by far the most powerful nation in the world. It had 50% of global GDP at that time. We forget that its policies in Asia were a series of failures, one failure after another. From the victory of the Chinese Communist Revolution, which, whatever we may think of it today, was certainly regarded as a major strategic disaster at the time. And what did Dean Acheson say about it? He says, we tried and we were unable to prevent it, which was then followed shortly thereafter, and partly as a consequence of it, The Korean War, which was not a very successful war, if you think about it. We kind of ended up at the end where we began, and at great loss and with great errors on our part, which then, moved us onward into the period of Southeast Asian turmoil and ultimately the Vietnam War. You can't look at our Asia policy and say, boy, the United States really could do whatever it wanted to do in those days. If you ask me and you look through all the decades of the Cold War and you compare it to today, the most I'm prepared to say is there were times when we were more influential and there were times when we were less influential. I go back to the 1970s. I would not trade our position today for our position in the 1970s. You talk about our inability to influence allies. In the 1970s, two of our closest allies in the Arab world and the Middle East imposed an oil embargo on the United States as a consequence of the 1973 war, which crippled the American economy, not just then, but for years to come. You could argue we've still never fully recovered from that crippling. And who were those countries that did that? The Iran of the Shah, our best buddy, and the Saudi royal family, our other best buddy. So apparently we were unable to have enough influence to prevent that from happening, not to mention not enough influence to prevent a succession of Middle Eastern wars from happening. So when people today say, look, we have no influence, we're not able to bring a peace settlement in the Middle East, I'm saying, when did we bring a peace settlement in the Middle East? I must have missed it. So the first thing we have to be careful of is not having a rosy view of the past with which to compare our unhappy present. The fact is, foreign policy is always hard. You lose more often than you win. You fail more often than you succeed in the best of circumstances. I like to compare it to hitting a baseball. If you fail to get a hit 70% of the time, you wind up in the Hall of Fame. And it's the same with foreign policy. I think a 30% success record is probably pretty good, but we have an impatience with failure, and so we tend to view our current failure as a sign of our decline. The only thing that I can say is that declinism is a hardy perennial throughout American history. We have the great Professor Paul Kennedy here, who wrote in the late 70s was it the late 80s, I should say, that the United States and the Soviet Union were both about to collapse, and of course he was half right about that. But he was everybody in every decade of the Cold War predicted the imminent decline of the United States. Henry Kissinger wrote a memo to Richard Nixon going into office saying you have to accept the fact that America is in terminal decline. In my own historical researches, I've found this going back as far as you can possibly go back to my favorite quotation from Patrick Henry in 1787, lamenting what had been lost from the days when the American spirit was in its youth, he said in 1787. So there is a tendency toward this, and in some ways it's healthy. I mean, Americans are constantly looking over their shoulders to see who might be catching up with them. It sometime was the Soviet Union. Right after the Soviet Union, it was Japan. Remember, the Cold War ended and Japan won. That was the big line in those days. And so it's healthy, and it leads us to put pressure on ourselves and try to reinvent ourselves and all that. But if you take a cold look at it, I think that it's simply not true. If you look at share of global GDP, for instance, in 1950 it was 50%. By 1969 it was 25% of our share of global GDP. A big drop. I don't think we were much less powerful. Big drop. Since 1969 we've gone from 25% share to about 21% share. I don't know what that means in terms of global power. When Britain was at its height, I think it had about a 10% share of global GDP. And yes, China has increased its share, and yes, India has increased its share, mostly at the expense of Europe, not really at the expense of the United States. In terms of military power, unless we're now in the process of dismantling our military, we are still far and away the most powerful nation in the world, with troops that have been fighting and are experienced. Our capacity to deliver troops, to send troops to distant regions is beyond comparison with that of any other country. I think most countries do not want to have a war with the United States head on if they can avoid it, and that's a good thing. We still spend, I don't know, what is it, more than the next 9 or 10 countries combined on defense. People say that like we should be unhappy about it. I'm thrilled by it. To me, that means we have got still this stability that is created by a disparity of power. The real question is not whether we have the capacity to continue playing this role in the world, but really whether we have the will and desire. And to my mind, as I look at the American scene today, that to me is the big question. As I say, that things are difficult out there, that it would be difficult to handle the Syria problem, right? Absolutely. It was always difficult. Bosnia was also difficult. Kosovo was also difficult. But the real question is, do you understand, is there a sense among the American people and their elected leaders that this order is necessary to preserve, that it's in America's interest to preserve it, that preserving it requires that the United States maintain its military strength as well as its economic power, and that be willing, on occasion, hopefully in the right circumstances, not in the wrong circumstances, to use that power? Or are we going to sort of go back in a way to where we were in the 1920s, now having been burned and being disillusioned by another war, much smaller, really, than World War I, needless to say, Iraq and Afghanistan, leading us to want to withdraw and not get into that kind of thing anymore. Again, it's an entirely understandable impulse, but if it leads us to forget that the world order is precious to us, that it is rare, that it will not outlive America's power and will to preserve it, that we could very quickly find ourselves back in the kind of mess that we pulled the world out of after World War II. To my mind, we're in our 1920s. We have maybe the mentality of the 1920s, and I don't know what the 1930s look like. I don't know what particular problem arises. It could be any number of things. The only thing that I feel fairly confident of is that if the United States does in fact withdraw its role, the role that it's played, and pull back from it, that we will see eventually a major change in the international system to our detriment. So I leave you with that sweet thought and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Would you like to go?
Yeah. So, Mr. Kagan, you seem to be suggesting that America has a role for intervention in the world, and I'd like you to clarify a little bit on that. When should we intervene and for what reasons?
Well, I wish I could tell you that there's a simple formula for when that is. There isn't a simple formula, because there are many challenges to the world order out there, and it's clear that we're not going to respond to all of them. But I do think that some do rise to the level where you begin to feel that if you don't respond to that, it does begin to have a deleterious effect on America's position in the world. I do think that, for instance, Syria rises to that level. Now, there's a lot of people in the political science world, international relations world, or at the Council on Foreign Relations who like to think that there is a very clear set of criteria that you can set up that'll tell you when to intervene and not when to intervene. And Richard Haas talks about the necessary wars versus the wars of choice. And he would like to cut down on the wars of choice and only fight the necessary wars. The problem is, first of all, almost every war that America's ever fought has been a war of choice. There are very few wars the United States has ever fought that were absolutely necessary, and I would include in that the Revolution, because there were probably other ways to go about eventually winning an acceptable relationship with the British. I'm sure Thomas Jefferson would disagree with me, but there are many people who argue the Civil War was not necessary. I don't happen to be one of them, but certainly argue it. World War I, the Philippines, I could go on. The problem is you never know in advance, including, I must say, Richard Haas, who once said that the Afghan war was necessary and has now decided that it was a war of choice. Afterwards, it's easier to see. Afterwards, it's easier to decide which wars were a mistake and which aren't. It's not my position that we have to be intervening everywhere, and obviously we could not. And what's required is statesmanship, not science, and deciding when things rise to the level that American power is necessary. The one thing I will say, the notion that we can avoid intervention, military interventions, is unrealistic. People out there use military power to achieve their objectives, and sometimes their objectives are so problematic that you can't allow them to do that, and the only way to prevent them from doing it is by responding with military power. That's the first problem. The second problem is it's going to fail some percentage of the time. It's going to be messy a huge percentage of the time. And no military action produces solutions where you can tie the pink ribbon and say everything is fine. And that includes World War II, which left a catastrophe in its wake, ultimately. So we have to have realistic understandings, not be profligate, I'm going to sound like Polonius here, not be profligate in the use of force, but also not be so unwilling to use force that things begin to slip away. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, you were there. No.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk, Mr. Kagan. Professor Petranovich, Department of Political Science. My own research agenda is the 19th century, antebellum thought, and one of your books, underrated books that people don't talk very much about, is Dangerous Nation.
Thank you.
Very influential in my work. So my question comes from my own research agenda, but since you've talked about some contemporary implications of your thought, let me frame it that way.
Yeah.
So human nature may not change, and I will agree with you with that. However, nature of nations or character of nations certainly does change. So look at Great Britain, for example, and how it has changed over the centuries. So is the United States today a bit less of a dangerous nation? To use your terminology, I want to invite you to sort of explain that term to the students a little bit because it's provocative. And why is that a bad thing? Maybe it would be good for us to know that that's not such a good thing. So, okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Well, the overall thesis of Dangerous Nation is that, contrary to what I think is a myth, not held by most historians, but certainly I would say in the general public, that America prior to, I don't know, Theodore Roosevelt was basically isolationist, basically minding our own business, wanting to stay away from the rest of the world. And what I try to point out is that from the very beginning, the United States, the American people, in fact, from before the beginning, even when they were a colonial power, that Americans were a very aggressive people, aggressive territorially, very expansionist, expansionist in terms of trade. And the term dangerous has to do, I got it from a quote from John Quincy Adams, who was then serving as ambassador to London, reporting back home that all of Europe thought the United States was a very dangerous nation. This is 1816 or something like that. So to try to turn around the image. And whether the United States has become less dangerous, I suppose, is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, the interesting thing about the United States, if you want to talk, setting aside the moral evaluation of it, at the end of the Cold War, the United States went off on what was probably the period of greatest frequency of intervention in its history. With intervening, I once counted, between 1989 and 2001, the United States intervened roughly every 2.5 years with some significant force, beginning with Bush's invasion of Panama and moving on from there. Different presidents, some of them are called realists, some of them are called idealists, some of them are called neocons, what have you. They all did the same thing. And so I'm not sure that anybody would say the Europeans in 2003 did not think the United States was less dangerous. Now, if your point is, if we are now about to move into a period where we are less interventionist, first, I want to be sure that we think that's actually true. I mean, if Barack Obama had decided to bomb Syria instead of asking Congress if he could bomb Syria, if he had done what every president had done before him, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, and he did bomb Libya, after all. I would expect after the two wars there to be a period of retrenchment. The question is it a permanent period or a temporary period? And You know, as I look at American history, American interventionism follows a kind of sine wave. We have periods of high interventionism followed usually by disillusionment and retrenchment, and then a period of low involvement, which is then triggered by some external action into a return to high. And I don't know whether we've broken out of that cycle or whether it's just a matter of time. Now, finally, to answer your question, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I believe that, for better or for worse, the willingness of the United States, the evident willingness of the United States on occasion to use military power is part of what keeps the international system where it is. That it would not be heartening, ultimately, to a very large number of nations around the world to believe that the United States was pretty much out of that business. Whether we're talking about the nations around Iran who were rooting for the United States to hit Syria if only to prove that we would hit somebody. I would say of the nations of East Asia that are worried about China and are worried about whether the United States will resist any effort by China, whether it's in the South China Sea or the East China Sea or Taiwan or what have you. There is, unfortunately for Americans, because they don't want to have to think this is true, a value in people knowing that the United States is still willing to use force on occasion. Now, it would be better if we used force successfully rather than unsuccessfully. But I think if you believe, as I do, and you may not, that military power is still at the base of the international order, if you believe that, then you have to not only have it, but when necessary, defined however you want to define it, be willing to use it.
I think you make a very convincing case for America's responsibility to intervene to uphold this sort of liberal, capitalist, democratic system that we've created. But what responsibility do we have to intervene in places for purely humanitarian reasons, places maybe like Rwanda, which either have very insignificant strategic importance or might even be contrary to our strategic goals?
Well, I mean, I think any nation is rarely going to intervene where it is clearly contrary to their strategic interests. But most humanitarian interventions don't fall under that category. Mostly, they're not necessarily damaging unless they lead to some terrible bogged down problem, which can happen. My feeling about those interventions, and even ones that are less purely humanitarian, because everything has got a humanitarian element to it, again, is that there's no formula that tells you when to do it and when not to do it, but neither, and you can decide that you're not going to do Rwanda, regardless of how horrible it is. But you should not imagine that were you not to do anything about Rwanda and not to do anything about the Balkans and not to do anything about Syria and not to do anything about the next crisis that evolves, that in a way it begins to accumulate. And it is clear that the one power that has sort of until now committed itself to the defense of a certain kind of order, ideally in cooperation with others, whether if you want to call it the international community, if the international community is repeatedly, with the United States at its head, sending the signal that we're just not going to do anything about this or this or this or this, then I believe you do start to see the fraying of the order. You know, the interesting thing about Assad and Saddam Hussein was that they both committed both humanitarian atrocities and they became a strategic problem. He committed an atrocity without chemical weapons, and then he committed an atrocity with chemical weapons, which then rose, even in Obama's mind, to the level of a strategic concern. Now, maybe this wouldn't be the case with Rwanda, for instance, but it is often the case that the two are closely linked. So again, I just want to reiterate, there's no way to say we're going to deal with every problem that's out there, but we also can't kid ourselves that by dealing with none of these problems, that we're not paying a price both in terms of our ability to have influence and in terms of the state of the international order.
Thank you. I want to ask a question related to your pointing out the disjunction between our capacity to maintain this kind of international role and our diminishing will. And how much do you think that the diminishing will is more than just an episodic reaction to things in Iraq and Afghanistan, and may be borne by the very success of the kind of world order, the extraordinary level of affluence and security never before precedented in human history, that I don't want to be oversimplified, say a country can almost become soft in a way, not realize the primal needs for power and geostrategic balance. And one thing related to that, if I may ask, is you see the last 10, 15, 20 years, the dropping of courses throughout academia on geostrategy, military history, and its replacement by other kinds of history. The very fact that your lecture today, I would venture to guess, would be pretty much consensus back in 1960, and probably would meet with less than half of the approval of the political science and history departments across the country. How much does that play into our diminishing role, and what kind of risk does that present?
Well, it's an excellent question, and you know, it's hard to argue. I'm not sure that it's affluence so much because, of course, it was in the Depression that the American people, you know, in the 20s and 30s, they went through a period of affluence in which they were sort of isolationist, then they went through a period of depression in which they were isolationist. So it's not necessarily that. My concern, which is probably related to, I think, what you're talking about, is that Americans have actually never, I would say, the narrative of American foreign policy for the average American has not been, we are a world order maintainer. What it has been is, oh, there are the Nazis, and the Japanese just hit us. And then in a few years, oh, there's the Soviets and the communists, and they're going to undermine us, et cetera. There was the Soviet threat. And then after the end of the Cold War, we're kind of living on fumes for a while, but strategic fumes. And then 9/11 happened, and now it's Al-Qaeda and radical Islam. And now that's fading because we haven't been hit lately. And what you would be left with is, where's the big enemy that justifies all of this? And since this was never really justified as world order maintenance, political leaders are now, who themselves may not even understand that that's what we're engaged in, are now left with the task of selling to the American people world order maintenance. I'm not sure the American people want to accept world order maintenance right now. I would say if I phrased this in this way to the average American, they would say, I don't feel like doing that right now. They would go where Richard Haas is going. Let's take care of our infrastructure. Let's take care of my problems at home. Because it's very hard to make a kind of causal link between what I call the erosion of world order and how that will directly affect Americans. And so I worry. I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, I suppose I don't know how to explain what goes on in political science departments, except that most of this new approach was actually born during the Cold War, so I'm not sure what the excuse is for them to have gone in this direction. But in any case, I do believe that the country as a whole, and maybe even the president, and maybe even people who are in the business of making foreign policy, or talking about foreign policy, don't understand what this role really has been. And we'll be in trouble as a result of that. Until the world order breaks down enough so that the next big threat smacks us in the face. If you had to ask me to predict how Americans are going to behave, it's going to have to get really bad, just as it did in the past. I hope we're smart enough to avoid that, but I'm not confident.
Hi, I just have two short questions, and I really appreciate your answers. The first one, you mentioned the large amount of military spending the United States has compared to other countries. To the average citizen like me, it seems extravagant. So at what point can we pare that back without sacrificing our some of the current order?
Yeah.
And the second question is, what happens when the United States comes to loggerheads with the rest of the order, like the UN, like when the United States and Israel vote one way in the UN and everyone else votes the other way? At what point do our interests transcend the legitimacy or the interests of the rest of the global order or Europe?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Those are two good questions. You know, on our military capacity, I think, you know, my personal view is we've already passed the point where it's becoming a problem. Now, why are we spending so much money on defense? And it's a good question. I believe, I've said to people that if you asked Americans why do we have a Navy, I'm not sure they would know what the answer to that is, because there's been nothing that seems to them to have, this is sort of the answer to your question. The reason we have a big Navy is so that we can keep waterways open, trade routes open, even in the event of conflict. I mean, just to talk about the Navy for a second, throughout most of history, when you had multipolar world with multiple navies, practically the first thing that would happen in any war is that one navy would try to shut off trade with that other nation. And the one thing that has happened throughout this period is the Americans, whether they were at war or not at war, they've kept the international trading system open. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that our Navy reassures countries that want to be protected against neighbors in a way that prevents them from moving in a dangerous direction. The country in particular I have in mind is Japan. Even the Chinese, at times of greatest wisdom and sobriety, have a sense that they want to have America remain present in the Pacific so that Japan doesn't take it upon itself to start rearming and to start acting independently, because that may be the most destabilizing factor. And the fact is that since World War II, the United States, both with its Navy and with its Army and with all the aspects of its military power, has been this preserver of relative security in three major regions of the world: the Pacific, East Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. I don't know which of those I'm willing to give up. Europe, our role has become less and less significant because Europe has been so secure and at peace, but there's been more than enough to do elsewhere, so that when we, in facing a crisis in the Middle East, have to pull aircraft carriers and other aspects of other parts of our surface fleet over to the Gulf and away from the East Asian theater, the immediate effect on that sends a signal to both our allies and to the Chinese that we're withdrawing. And we need to provide that security, and it costs money. And whenever people talk about the defense budget and how much it costs, I really feel like there is an analysis that people do not undertake. It seems to me in any kind of expenditure, you have to ask yourself not only how much something costs, but what would the price of not spending this money be? You know, you can have a cheaper car if you take off the bumpers, but if you get into an accident, it's more expensive. You can drive your car without insurance, but if you get into an accident without insurance, it would have been better to pay the insurance. To my mind, the defense budget is, we're paying insurance. If the result of our withdrawing our power to some degree from the Asian theater, for instance, would be another war, which it could be, we would have to get involved. And then the expense is so much greater, so much greater. So in any calculation of how much money we should be spending, you have to ask, what would it cost if we don't do it? And that, I think, is inadequate. As far as the UN is concerned, look, one thing, the United States itself has not been consistently on the wrong side of the UN. It's mostly been in a majority of 3 versus 2 or a majority of 4 versus 1. But secondly, you know, no, the UN is not the ultimate authority. It has not achieved a position of having real global legitimacy that everyone abides by. People pay it lip service. Even we pay it lip service. We paid it lip service throughout the 40 years of the Cold War, even though we ignored it 99% of the time. It has not reached that level because that is not what the world looks like. The world is still a world based on power and great powers, and it's not the ultimate decisions are not being made at the United Nations Security Council. So I find most Americans are untroubled by not having everybody on our side of the Security Council. When Russia finds itself isolated at the Security Council, sometimes it enjoys it. So I don't know that, you know, we are not there yet in terms of that, to my mind, being the ultimate source of legitimacy for action. Yes?
So you just touched on the Security Council a little bit, but we do, in fact, seek their approval sometimes, whether or not we ask for it officially or we take it. And there was just a lot of controversy over Syria. Yep. And so I was wondering, if we want to maintain our place in the world, as the powers are developing, should we expand the veto powers? Yes.
I mean, I'm a big, as I would say most American policymakers are big proponents of expanding the permanent membership of the Security Council with veto wielding to include India, to include Japan. I would say, if Germans were here, I would say Germany, but what I really mean is the EU. But of course, the people who currently have the seats on the permanent 5, none of them want any of that to happen. The Chinese don't want Japan or India in. They don't want a potential adversary that has an equal power. veto. The British and the French don't want, even though they claim, well, not the British so much, but the French, even though they claim to be the great devotees of the EU, they don't want to have an EU seat. These veto powers are precious things, especially the powers that don't have vast military power, and nobody wants to give it up. But I would be in favor of it, and I think it's long overdue. After all, the Permanent Five are an incredible anachronism in the modern world. They were set up, Franklin Roosevelt decided who was going to be on the UN Security Council, and it was the allies. It was all our allies, and plus China, which we thought would be a tame sort of puppet at the Security Council, turned out otherwise. A Security Council that reflected a permanent representation on the Security Council reflected the modern world would have India, would have Brazil, would have Japan, and the United States is not the obstacle to that.
Hello. You've spoken a lot about the role of the military kind of in maintaining a stable world order. I was wondering what you thought of some non-military options, like, for example, aid, whether to Egypt, or diplomacy with respect to Iran, whether they're as effective in kind of maintaining a stable world order, whether they're just temporary, and whether we should focus on those and what relationship they should play.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a whole panoply of tools that have various degrees of importance. And my own view is that in the case of Egypt, our best tool was the aid relationship, and for a variety of reasons we chose not to use it. But I think that was a mistake. And I wouldn't say, obviously because, Egypt is behaving undemocratically, you're not going to invade it, but what you could do is use this aid relationship as leverage, but we didn't do that. And obviously diplomacy is the first choice, and diplomacy is what we engage in every day around the world on many different issues, and that is the right approach. War is never the first choice. But I do remember what my old boss, George Shultz, always used to say over and over and over again, which is that diplomacy that is not backed by force or the threat of force or the possibility of force has much less chance of success than when the two are used in combination. And George Shultz was not a militarist. George Shultz wanted to use diplomacy. He was a Secretary of State, not a Secretary of War. But he felt that you had to have that. And that's why, and there's been this great desire and effort among the sort of intelligentsia in this country to devalue military power and raise as a substitute so-called soft power of various kinds. But I have to say that even Joe Nye, who sort of invented and patented the words soft power, also says in his book that it needs to be combined with military power. At the end of the day, I have to say, contrary to what I think some people may believe, people don't listen to the United States because they like us. They don't listen to us because they admire us. This is our fiction. This is a very self-aggrandizing fiction, that everybody loves us. That's why they do what we want, or if they ever do what we want. At the end of the day, it's power in its various forms, and certainly in many important circumstances, it's military power. I think I have exhausted all of you, so shall we call it a day? Yeah? Thank you.